I still remember the way she looked at me that night. My sister-in-law, her lips curved in that perfect little smile as she said, "Some people mistake hard work for class." Everyone laughed. I just sat there, silent. What she didn't know was that the woman she was mocking was about to shatter every illusion she'd ever built about herself. My name is Lauren Hayes, and I'm 55 years old. For most of my life, people have seen me as composed, the woman who never raises her voice, never loses control, and always keeps things professional. But what they don't see are the battles I've fought in silence, in boardrooms, in family dinners, and sometimes within my own home. I live in Chicago, Illinois, a city that mirrors my life perfectly, bright, structured, yet full of unspoken tension beneath the surface. Every morning, I wake up before sunrise, pour myself a cup of black coffee, and stare at the skyline from my apartment window. The glass towers remind me of ambition, beautiful from afar, but built on pressure. I've spent 30 years in the corporate world. Today, I'm the vice president of global strategy at one of Chicago's leading software corporations. I manage teams in 4 countries, oversee multimillion-dollar partnerships, and make decisions that shape how our company operates around the world. It sounds powerful, and it is, but it came at a price. Late nights, missed anniversaries, endless flights, and most of all, being judged not for what I've achieved, but for daring to be more than what others expected from me. At home, things are calmer, or at least they used to be. My husband, Ethan Hayes, is a kind man. We've been married for over 25 years. He's a software engineer. Smart, quiet, the kind of man who prefers fixing problems instead of talking about them. We've shared love, comfort, and even silence that felt safe. But recently, that silence has started to feel different, heavier, like something unsaid was floating between us. That something revealed itself one cold Wednesday evening. I just returned from a week-long business trip in Boston, still half tired, still half in work mode, when Ethan walked into the kitchen holding his phone, that expression on his face I'd seen too many times before. The one that always meant he was about to say something I wouldn't like. "Lauren," he began softly, "I wanted to tell you earlier, but Victoria's coming to visit." I paused, setting down my mug. "Victoria?" He nodded, adjusting his glasses. "Yeah. She's flying in from New York this weekend. Staying with Mom." I forced a smile. 12 years since we've seen her, right? "Almost 13, he muttered. "She says she's been meaning to visit for ages." Victoria Hayes. Just hearing her name made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain. She wasn't evil, just sharp. A woman who believed her wealth and charm made her superior to everyone else. Victoria was the kind who asked questions that sounded polite but were designed to cut. The kind who could make you feel small without ever raising her voice. I had only met her a handful of times, weddings, family gatherings, holidays, but I'd never forgotten her tone when she first met me. "So you work in technology? That must be exhausting. I don't think I could ever survive in such a dull environment." That day, I laughed it off. I told myself she didn't mean it that way. But years later, her voice still echoed in my head, dripping with that same sugar-coated arrogance. "Lauren." Ethan's voice broke my thoughts. "Yes." "There's something else," he said, his tone shifting. "I might have, simplified things when I told her about you." My hand froze over the counter. "Simplified?" He exhaled. "I told her you work in an office downtown. I didn't mention your title. Or the company. Or any of that." For a moment, I just stood there, staring at him. The refrigerator hummed softly in the background. "Why would you do that?" I asked, keeping my voice even. He rubbed his neck. "You know how she gets." I didn't want to give her another reason to start comparing or judging. I just thought if I kept it simple, It would be easier for everyone. Easier, I repeated quietly. So you told your sister your wife is, what, an assistant? His eyes widened. No, I didn't say that. I held up my hand. It's fine. But it wasn't fine. It never was. Inside, something cold started spreading through my chest. Not anger exactly. More like disappointment mixed with the faint sting of humiliation. Ethan wasn't a bad man. But this was something I'd seen before. Men trying to protect their pride by dimming their partner's light. And I wasn't angry because of the lie. I was angry because he thought my success was something that needed hiding. That night, while he slept, I sat alone by the living room window. Outside, the city lights flickered against the glass, each one reflecting a part of the woman I had become. Confident, strategic, and quiet when she needed to be. I took a slow sip of coffee and smiled to myself. If Victoria wanted to meet a simple office worker, that's exactly who I'd let her meet. But I'd make sure that by the end of the weekend, she'd never underestimate a quiet woman again. My name is Lauren Hayes, and I'm 55 years old. For most of my life, people have seen me as composed, the woman who never raises her voice, never loses control, and always keeps things professional. But what they don't see are the battles I've fought in silence, in boardrooms, in family dinners, and sometimes, within my own home. I live in Chicago, Illinois, a city that mirrors my life perfectly, bright, structured, yet full of unspoken tension beneath the surface. Every morning, I wake up before sunrise, pour myself a cup of black coffee, and stare at the skyline from my apartment window. The glass towers remind me of ambition, beautiful from afar, but built on pressure. I've spent 30 years in the corporate world. Today, I'm the vice president of global strategy at one of Chicago's leading software corporations. I manage teams in 4 countries, oversee multimillion-dollar partnerships, and make decisions that shape how our company operates around the world. It sounds powerful, and it is, but it came at a price. Late nights, missed anniversaries, endless flights, and most of all, being judged not for what I've achieved, but for daring to be more than what others expected from me. At home, things are calmer, or at least they used to be. My husband, Ethan Hayes, is a kind man. We've been married for over 25 years. He's a software engineer. Smart, quiet, the kind of man who prefers fixing problems instead of talking about them. We've shared love, comfort, and even silence that felt safe. But recently, that silence has started to feel different, heavier, like something unsaid was floating between us. That something revealed itself one cold Wednesday evening. I just returned from a week-long business trip in Boston, still half tired, still half in work mode, when Ethan walked into the kitchen holding his phone, that expression on his face I'd seen too many times before. The one that always meant he was about to say something I wouldn't like. "Lauren," he began softly, "I wanted to tell you earlier, but Victoria's coming to visit." I paused, setting down my mug. "Victoria?" He nodded, adjusting his glasses. "Yeah. She's flying in from New York this weekend. Staying with Mom." I forced a smile. 12 years since we've seen her, right? "Almost 13, he muttered. "She says she's been meaning to visit for ages." Victoria Hayes. Just hearing her name made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't explain. She wasn't evil, just sharp. A woman who believed her wealth and charm made her superior to everyone else. Victoria was the kind who asked questions that sounded polite but were designed to cut. The kind who could make you feel small without ever raising her voice. I had only met her a handful of times, weddings, family gatherings, holidays, but I'd never forgotten her tone when she first met me. "So you work in technology? That must be exhausting. I don't think I could ever survive in such a dull environment." That day, I laughed it off. I told myself she didn't mean it that way. But years later, her voice still echoed in my head, dripping with that same sugar-coated arrogance. Lauren. Ethan's voice broke my thoughts. Yes. There's something else, he said, his tone shifting. I might have, simplified things when I told her about you. My hand froze over the counter. Simplified. He exhaled. I told her you work in an office downtown. I didn't mention your title. Or the company. Or any of that. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at him. The refrigerator hummed softly in the background. Why would you do that? I asked, keeping my voice even. He rubbed his neck. You know how she gets. I didn't want to give her another reason to start comparing or judging. I just thought if I kept it simple, it would be easier for everyone. Easier, I repeated quietly. So you told your sister your wife is, what, an assistant? His eyes widened. No, I didn't say that. I held up my hand. It's fine. But it wasn't fine. It never was. Inside, something cold started spreading through my chest. Not anger exactly. More like disappointment mixed with the faint sting of humiliation. Ethan wasn't a bad man. But this was something I'd seen before. Men trying to protect their pride by dimming their partner's light. And I wasn't angry because of the lie. I was angry because he thought my success was something that needed hiding. That night, while he slept, I sat alone by the living room window. Outside, the city lights flickered against the glass, each one reflecting a part of the woman I had become. Confident, strategic, and quiet when she needed to be. I took a slow sip of coffee and smiled to myself. If Victoria wanted to meet a simple office worker, that's exactly who I'd let her meet. But I'd make sure that by the end of the weekend, she'd never underestimate a quiet woman again. By the end of the evening, Victoria seemed satisfied. She believed she'd measured me, categorized me, and found me ordinary. And maybe that's exactly what I wanted. Because what she didn't know was that the calmest waters often hide the deepest storms. Sunday evening came faster than I expected. I had spent most of the day cleaning the kitchen, organizing a few files, and pretending that Victoria's words from last night hadn't settled somewhere deep inside me. But they had. They always did. Every sentence of hers had been dipped in charm and sharpened with quiet disdain. By 6:30, Ethan and I were back in the car, driving toward Margaret's house for Sunday dinner. The streets were already dim, and Chicago's wind carried that dry bite that makes even silence sound cold. Ethan drove quietly, his hands fixed on the steering wheel. I could tell he was nervous again, the same kind of nervous that makes people talk too much or not at all. Please, he said after a while, his voice tight, just don't let her get to you, okay? I turned to him slowly. Get to me? Ethan, she doesn't get to me. He gave a small, unconvincing smile. You know what I mean. Yes, I said softly, looking out the window. I do. What I didn't tell him was that I already had a plan. Not for revenge, not to humiliate her, but for something more satisfying. Something subtle. I wanted her to see what she really was, without me saying a single cruel word. When we arrived, the house was lit like a showroom. Candles on the table, crystal glasses sparkling under the light, and a faint scent of vanilla and money. Margaret opened the door, smiling that polite, distant smile she always saved for me. Lauren, sweetheart. Come in. Inside, Victoria stood near the dining table, dressed in deep emerald green, the kind of color that demanded attention. She turned as we entered and smiled. Lauren, she said, you look simple. It's refreshing. Thank you, I replied evenly, removing my coat. I find comfort in simplicity. She tilted her head as if examining a painting that didn't quite impress her. Of course. Not everyone needs to stand out to feel important. I smiled. Exactly. Ethan cleared his throat and moved to pour the wine, desperate to fill the air with something other than tension. Victoria accepted her glass like a queen accepting an offering. "I brought this back from Italy," she announced. "You can't find it here. It's around $300 a bottle, but worth every penny." I nodded politely. "That's generous." As we sat down, the conversation began much like last night. Light, shallow, and dripping with Victoria's favorite topic, herself. She told us about a gala she attended, the renovations on her husband's penthouse, the stress of maintaining a high-profile lifestyle. Every now and then, she threw a soft jab in my direction. "So, Lauren," she began halfway through the meal, "I've been meaning to ask, after all these years, don't you ever get bored of office work? Filing, typing, answering calls? I suppose some people just prefer routine." I lifted my eyes slowly, meeting hers with calm curiosity. "Routine can be comforting," I said. "You never know what might happen if you break it." She smiled sweetly, missing the edge in my tone. "That's true. I could never imagine not pushing myself toward bigger things." "Like handbags?" I asked softly. She blinked, a hint of confusion crossing her face. "Excuse me?" "I just remember you mentioned your collection last night," I said innocently. 12 Birkin bags, was it? That's quite an accomplishment." Ethan coughed to hide his laugh, but Victoria straightened her back. "It's not about owning them," she said, her tone clipped. "It's about appreciating art and craftsmanship. They represent value, refinement." "Of course," I replied, smiling faintly. "Refinement." She studied me for a moment, as though unsure whether I was mocking her. Then she gave a dismissive little laugh. "Well, not everyone understands that kind of lifestyle." Margaret chimed in softly. "Victoria has always had an eye for elegance." Victoria nodded, pleased. "It's not just elegance, Mother. It's knowing quality when you see it. You can tell a lot about a person from the brands they wear, their taste, their discipline, their ambition." I raised an eyebrow. "And those who can't afford them?" "Oh, I didn't mean poor people," she said quickly, waving her hand. "I just mean, certain circles of class." "Class," I repeated, swirling the wine in my glass. "Interesting word. Some people define it by price tags. Others define it by how they treat people." The silence that followed was almost beautiful. Ethan froze mid-bite, Margaret blinked, and Victoria's smile faltered for the briefest second. She recovered quickly. "Oh, of course. Kindness is important too," she said, though the word too told me exactly where it ranked on her list. Dinner continued. The more she talked, the more her insecurities slipped through the cracks of her confidence. She wasn't insulting me out of malice. She was performing, desperate to stay on top, terrified that someone might not see her as superior. Then came the moment that changed everything. Victoria leaned back in her chair, smirking. "Lauren, may I ask you something a bit personal?" "Go ahead." "Do you ever feel small sitting next to Ethan in these family gatherings?" she said with a laugh. "I mean, everyone knows you've always been modest. But I suppose that's its own kind of charm." Ethan looked up sharply. "Victoria." "No, it's fine," I said calmly. "Please continue." She hesitated for a beat, surprised by my composure. "Well," she said, smiling faintly, "it's just that confidence comes naturally to some people. To others it's borrowed." I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm, steady, and cool as glass. "That's true. But you'd be surprised how often confidence gets mistaken for noise." For a second, something flickered in her eyes. Confusion, maybe irritation. I smiled. "You see, I've met plenty of people who speak loudly, dress beautifully, and still have nothing to say. They collect things to fill the silence inside them. Her fork paused halfway to her mouth. Are you implying something? I looked straight at her. Not implying. Observing. Ethan's gaze darted between us, nervous but silently rooting for me. Margaret looked uneasy, sensing a shift she couldn't name. Victoria gave a tight laugh. You've become rather philosophical all of a sudden. Not at all, I said softly. Just paying attention. For the first time that evening, she didn't have a ready comeback. She sipped her wine instead, eyes flicking toward her brother. Ethan, you didn't tell me Lauren had such opinions. Ethan met her stare. There's a lot about Lauren you don't know. And in that instant I saw it, the faint crack in Victoria's perfect poise. She smiled, but her eyes hardened. Well, she said, rising from her seat, I suppose everyone has their surprises. I smiled too. Yes, everyone does. That night, as we drove home, Ethan reached over and took my hand. You handled that beautifully, he said quietly. I looked out the window, at the endless city lights passing by. Oh, Ethan, I said with a small smile. You have no idea what's coming next. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't just defending myself. I was preparing to show her, and everyone, exactly who I really was. By Monday morning, the fire inside me had turned into focus. I sat in my home office, surrounded by quiet, the hum of my computer, the soft ticking of the clock, and the sharp taste of purpose running through my veins. The night before had changed something. I'd seen it in Victoria's eyes, the first glint of uncertainty, that flicker of fear that comes when someone realizes their assumptions might be wrong. And that was only the beginning. At 9 sharp, my laptop chimed with a video call request from Jonathan Reed, the CEO of the corporation where I worked. Morning, Lauren, he said. We've finalized the merger with Apex Digital. I need you to lead the announcement at tomorrow's press conference. Global team, high stakes, the spotlight's on you. I smiled. Understood. I'll have everything ready by tonight. After the call ended, I sat for a moment, hands folded, breathing deeply. This was what I did best. Take chaos and turn it into clarity. I'd built a career on leadership that didn't shout but commanded. My annual salary, bonuses, and stock dividends now added up to well over $350,000 a year, yet no one in my family, not even Victoria, had a clue. And that's how I preferred it. Because power means nothing when you have to announce it. That evening, Ethan walked into the study holding his phone. Victoria texted, he said cautiously. She wants to take us out to dinner tomorrow night before she leaves. I raised an eyebrow. Another dinner? He nodded. At the Belmont Club downtown. She said she made reservations in our name. Of course she did. A private club with velvet chairs, gold chandeliers, and a reputation for exclusivity. The kind of place where people go not to eat but to be seen. Perfect. The next day felt like a blur. Meetings. Presentations. One interview after another. By 5:30 p.m., I'd successfully handled the press conference and secured our company's stock climb, another quiet victory. But as the applause faded and cameras shut off, my mind was already elsewhere. This dinner wasn't just another family meal. It was the final act of a play Victoria didn't even realize she was starring in. The Belmont Club was all polished marble and soft piano music. The kind of place where every server moved like choreography. Victoria arrived first, radiant as always, wearing a fitted black gown and dripping with confidence. Lauren, she said as I entered. You look professional tonight. Almost different. Just coming straight from work, I replied lightly. Of course, she said, smiling as if she'd caught me trying too hard. I told the manager to give us a private table. Important people need space. I followed her through the room, feeling eyes turn, not toward her but toward me. The staff nodded respectfully, a few even whispered my name under their breath. It wasn't arrogance, it was recognition. I'd met with several of the club's investors during the recent merger. But Victoria, of course, assumed the attention belonged to her. Once seated, she began her usual monologue. "Ethan, I told Mother we simply must upgrade her place. The furniture is so dated. I'll send her some designers next month." Ethan murmured something polite, his eyes flicking nervously toward me. "And Lauren," Victoria continued, "you must tell me, how do you manage with all that office stress? I suppose your company doesn't give you much creative freedom." I smiled, taking a sip of my wine. "Actually, they do. I just finished overseeing a global merger today." Her laughter rang through the air, light and disbelieving. "A merger? Oh, how interesting. You assist with those kinds of things." "Not quite," I said softly. "I led it." Her smile froze for half a second. "You led it?" "Yes. I'm the Vice President of Global Strategy for Lincrest Technologies." I let the words settle. It's one of the companies featured in Forbes this quarter. You may have seen the article. The silence that followed was pure, perfect, and long. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked at her, calm, composed, the way I'd been all weekend. Ethan exhaled slowly beside me, finally understanding why I hadn't fought back before. Victoria blinked, her tone faltering. I didn't realize. Ethan never mentioned." "No," I interrupted gently. "He didn't. He thought it would be easier if you believed I was ordinary." Her eyes flicked toward her brother, searching for confirmation. Ethan nodded once, shame softening his face. "Well," she said after a moment, straightening in her chair, "titles don't define a person." "No," I said. "But behavior does." Her face flushed. "You're implying I've been rude?" "I'm not implying," I replied evenly. "I'm observing." Her jaw tightened. "You know, Lauren, not everyone values the same things. Some of us work for passion, not status." I leaned forward slightly. "And some of us understand that real class isn't about who talks the loudest, it's about who listens when others speak." The words landed like glass breaking softly on marble. Her composure cracked, just slightly, but enough for everyone at the surrounding tables to notice. The rest of the dinner passed in awkward quiet. The woman who had spent 2 nights teaching me about refinement now couldn't meet my eyes. When the bill came, I handed my card to the waiter, the corporate black one. Victoria started to protest, but the waiter interrupted politely. "Mrs. Hayes, your membership already covers tonight's expenses," he said with a nod. "Thank you again for your contributions to the club's redevelopment fund." I smiled. Of course. Glad to support a place that values excellence. Victoria's expression was priceless. A mix of confusion, disbelief, and the dawning realization that she'd been wrong about me from the very beginning. That night, as we left the restaurant, Ethan reached for my hand. "She'll never forget this," he murmured. "I don't need her to," I said softly. "I just needed her to see me clearly, for once." The cold Chicago air hit my face as we stepped outside. It felt clean, final. I had no interest in winning a battle. I'd simply ended a war she didn't even know she'd started. The next morning, sunlight poured through the blinds in thin golden lines, but the air inside our apartment felt heavy with unspoken thoughts. Ethan sat at the kitchen table with his coffee untouched, scrolling aimlessly through his phone. I could tell he was still processing last night. The look on Victoria's face when I revealed who I truly was, the stunned silence that followed, the waiter's words confirming that I wasn't the woman his sister had imagined me to be. He finally spoke. "She won't get over that dinner anytime soon," he said with a half-laugh. Good, I replied, stirring my tea. Maybe she'll finally stop judging people based on handbags and penthouses. Ethan sighed, setting his phone down. I should have never hidden your position from her. I thought I was protecting peace, but I realize now. I was protecting her ego. I looked at him and smiled faintly. I know you meant well. But peace built on lies doesn't last. He reached across the table and took my hand. You've handled all of this better than I ever could have. You didn't yell, you didn't insult her, you just showed her who you really are. That's the thing about truth, I said softly. It doesn't need volume. It just needs the right moment. Later that week, I returned to work, back to the glass offices, the fast-paced meetings, and the weight of real responsibility. Yet everything felt a little lighter now. I wasn't thinking about Victoria's voice anymore. For years, I'd let people like her make me second-guess myself. Women who thought value came from appearance, not integrity. But after that dinner, I realized something. I didn't need anyone's approval to feel enough. Around noon, Jonathan stopped by my office. Congratulations on the merger, Lauren. The board's thrilled. We're increasing your annual bonus, and there's talk of offering you a seat on the Global Executive Council. I smiled. Thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate the trust. As he left, I stared at the skyline outside my window, the same Chicago skyline I'd watched for decades, only this time it looked different. It didn't feel like pressure anymore. It felt like proof of how far I'd come and how quietly I'd built everything that now stood behind my name. That evening, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. When I answered, there was a pause. Then a familiar voice, soft and strained. Lauren. It's Victoria. I stayed silent. I just wanted to say, she hesitated. I didn't realize how much I'd misjudged you. I thought I understood success. I thought I had it all figured out. But you made me see things differently. You made me see myself differently. Her voice cracked slightly, but she pushed through it. You didn't humiliate me, even though you could have. You just held up a mirror. And it hurt. Because I didn't like what I saw. I took a slow breath. Victoria, you don't owe me an apology. You just owe yourself honesty. You can't measure your worth in things that disappear when the lights go out. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You're right. I suppose I've been living for applause, not peace. Then stop, I said gently. Find what makes you proud when no one's watching. There was another silence, softer this time. Thank you, she whispered. For not being cruel. You could have been. But you weren't. After she hung up, I sat for a while, letting the quiet sink in. It wasn't satisfaction I felt, it was closure. Because for once, Victoria had spoken without vanity. A few weeks passed. The merger settled smoothly, and I returned to my routine. Early mornings, long meetings, quiet dinners. But every so often, I'd catch Ethan watching me with a look I hadn't seen in years. A mix of pride, admiration, and something else. Gratitude. One night, as we sat together watching the city lights, he said, You know, I think I finally understand what strength looks like. I smiled, resting my head on his shoulder. And what's that? It's not the loudest person in the room, he said softly. It's the one who doesn't need to prove anything at all. I looked out the window at the skyline again, the same view that had witnessed my rise, my silence, and my resolve. The world outside was loud, full of people chasing status and recognition. But inside, everything was calm, grounded. Because peace doesn't come from being seen. It comes from knowing who you are when no one else does. And I, Lauren Hayes, had finally learned that lesson. A month passed, and the air in Chicago softened from winter's steel to early spring's gold. The snow had melted into thin veins of water running along the sidewalks, and the city began to hum again. Buses, footsteps, laughter. I walked through it all one morning, holding my coffee, feeling lighter than I had in years. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't rushing toward anything. I wasn't climbing, proving, defending, or chasing. I was just living. At work, things were thriving. The merger had exceeded expectations, and the board's decision was unanimous. I was promoted to Senior Vice President of Global Operations. It was the highest position I'd ever held, and while congratulations poured in from around the world, I felt a quiet pride instead of excitement. My success no longer needed applause. That same afternoon, I received a message that took me by surprise. It was from Victoria. "Lauren, I'll be in Chicago for a few days. I'd like to see you. No fancy dinner this time. Just coffee, my treat." I stared at the message for a long moment. Part of me hesitated, remembering the woman who had once belittled everything I was. But another part, the part that had long since learned forgiveness isn't weakness, typed back. "Sure. Tomorrow. 10 a.m. at Café Verve." The next morning, I arrived first. It was a small, locally owned café, full of warm light and the scent of roasted beans. When Victoria walked in, she looked different. Softer somehow. Her hair was tied back simply, and she wasn't wearing a single visible logo or piece of jewelry. Just a plain gray coat and a nervous smile. "Lauren," she said, almost shyly, "you look well." "So do you," I replied, genuinely surprised. We ordered coffee and sat by the window. For a few seconds, it felt awkward, two women who had been on opposite sides of invisible walls, now sitting in the same calm morning light. She spoke first. "I went back to New York and couldn't stop thinking about that dinner," she said quietly. "I realized I've spent most of my life performing. I wasn't living. I was proving. And I was tired, Lauren. Exhausted." I listened silently. "I've started volunteering," she continued, her voice unsteady but sincere. "At a women's shelter downtown. I wanted to do something that didn't need a camera or applause. Something real." A small smile touched my lips. "That's good, Victoria. It suits you." She laughed softly. "You think so?" "I do," I said. "It's strange, isn't it? How long it takes us to learn that success means nothing if it costs you peace." She nodded. "I learned that from you. That night, when you could have embarrassed me, you chose dignity instead. I didn't understand it then. I do now." Her eyes shimmered, not from guilt, but gratitude. And for the first time, I saw her not as the woman who had insulted me, but as someone still learning who she was beneath all the noise. We talked for over an hour. About work, life, mistakes, forgiveness. No sharp tones, no hidden jabs. Just two women, different but equal. As she stood to leave, she turned back and said, "You know, Lauren, you may have been the one who taught me that power doesn't need to shout." I smiled. "And you may have been the one who reminded me that even the proud can change, if someone holds up the right mirror." She nodded, her smile trembling slightly. "Goodbye, Lauren." "Goodbye, Victoria." That night, as I stood by the window of my apartment, the city lights twinkled across the river like stars that refused to fade. Ethan joined me, wrapping an arm around my shoulder. "So," he asked quietly, "how did it go?" "She's learning," I said simply. He kissed my forehead. "You always manage to change people without even trying." I shook my head. "Not change. Just remind them who they could be." He smiled. "That's what makes you different." Outside, the world kept spinning, the traffic, the noise, the constant race for more. But I stood still, calm, content, complete. Because in a world obsessed with appearances, I had chosen substance. In a life that prized noise, I had chosen silence. And in a family that once measured worth in wealth, I had finally shown what true value really meant. Not money. Not titles. Not applause. Just grace, the kind you can't buy, can't fake, and can't take away. And as I turned away from the window, I whispered softly to myself. Some people spend their whole lives chasing worth. I just decided to live mine with it. Weeks passed, and life slowly found its rhythm again. But this time, it was different, quieter, richer, and filled with a calm I hadn't felt in years. The tension that used to hang between Ethan and me was gone, replaced by a new kind of understanding, the kind that only comes when masks finally fall away. Ethan had started looking at me differently. Not with surprise anymore, but with admiration. There was no unease about my title, no awkwardness when I mentioned work. He was proud, truly proud. I could feel it in the way he listened when I spoke about projects or the way he'd brag quietly to friends. My wife led that deal. You probably read about it. It wasn't about money for him anymore. It was about respect, something we'd both learned to rebuild from the ground up. One Friday evening, after finishing a late board review, I found Ethan waiting for me downstairs. The cold wind carried a faint scent of rain, and he was standing beside the car with 2 cups of coffee in hand. Thought you could use a break, he said, smiling. We drove aimlessly for a while, past Lake Michigan, through the quiet streets of Gold Coast, talking about nothing and everything. Finally, Ethan parked by the pier, the skyline glowing behind us like a wall of golden glass. Lauren, he said, his voice low and steady, I want to tell you something I should have said long ago. I turned toward him. When I asked you to hide who you were, I wasn't just protecting my sister's pride. I was protecting my own insecurity. I didn't realize it then, but part of me was scared. Scared that I'd married a woman who outgrew me. I didn't interrupt. I just let him speak. He took a deep breath. But that night at the club, watching you handle her with grace, watching you stand tall without a single harsh word, I've never been more proud to be your husband. You didn't just teach Victoria a lesson, Lauren. You taught me one too. For a long time, I didn't say anything. The only sound was the water slapping gently against the pier. Then I reached over and took his hand. Ethan, I said softly, I never needed you to match me. I just needed you to stand beside me. That's all I ever wanted. He nodded slowly, eyes glistening under the city light. And I will. From now on, always. The following weekend, we were invited to Margaret's home for a small family dinner. When I arrived, something felt different. The atmosphere wasn't heavy. There was no tension, no forced politeness. Margaret greeted me with warmth I hadn't felt in years, and as she led us into the dining room, I saw Victoria there, already seated. She rose when she saw me. Lauren, she said gently, I'm glad you came. I smiled. So am I. Her tone was different, quieter, genuine. She looked changed. Not in the superficial way of clothes or style, but in the way her eyes held a new kind of humility. Throughout dinner, she didn't dominate the conversation. She asked questions, real ones. She asked about my work, about my travels, about my perspective. And she listened, really listened. At one point, Margaret mentioned an upcoming charity event she wanted to support, and Victoria smiled. Actually, I've been helping organize something similar in New York, for women in small businesses. Lauren inspired the idea. I blinked, surprised. I did. Yes, she said with a small nod. You once said that real class is how you treat people. I never forgot that. So I decided to start putting it into practice. I sat there quietly for a moment, looking at her. This woman who had once treated me like an inconvenience now speaking like someone reborn. It wasn't a show. It was real. Maybe, for the first time in her life, she'd finally stopped performing. After dinner, Victoria and I stood outside near the steps, the air crisp and cool. She turned to me with a faint smile. "You know," she said softly, "for years, I thought money gave me security. But I realized it only gave me noise. You live in silence, Lauren, but it's the kind of silence that fills a room." I smiled. Silence has its own kind of power. It lets truth breathe. She nodded, wrapping her coat tighter. "I used to think silence was weakness. Now I think it's grace." We stood there for a long moment, two women who had once been opponents now standing as equals, maybe even friends. As she walked toward her car, she turned one last time. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for never fighting me. You let me fight myself." I watched her leave, her car lights fading down the street. Ethan came up behind me, slipping his arm around my waist. "She's changed," he said softly. "Yes," I whispered. "Sometimes people just need a mirror, not a lecture." He smiled. "And you've always been the kind of mirror that shows the truth." That night, as I looked out over the glowing skyline, I thought about everything that had happened, the humiliation, the restraint, the slow transformation that followed. It struck me then, power doesn't lie in titles or paychecks. It lies in how much strength it takes to stay kind in the face of arrogance, to stay calm when insulted, to stay graceful when underestimated. And perhaps, that's what victory really looks like. Not a moment of triumph, but a lifetime of dignity. I poured myself a cup of tea and whispered into the quiet of my home. In the end, class isn't what you wear, it's how you rise. Spring melted into summer, and with it came a peace that felt earned, not given. Life had slowed into something simple again, early mornings, quiet commutes, dinners that tasted better because they weren't burdened by tension. The kind of peace that comes not from winning, but from understanding what's truly worth fighting for. Victoria and I stayed in touch, in our own quiet way. Every few weeks, she'd send me a message, a photograph from a shelter she volunteered at, a quote that inspired her, or just a simple "thinking of you today." There was no performance left in her tone. No need to prove anything. Sometimes, change doesn't come through confrontation. It comes through reflection, through a mirror held steady enough for someone to finally see themselves clearly. And that's what I had given her. Not a battle, not a lecture, but a reflection. One afternoon, as I left the office, Jonathan, our CEO, stopped me by the elevators. "Lauren," he said, "the board's been talking. We're expanding to Europe next year, and we want you to oversee the international branch. You'd be relocating for at least 6 months. Think about it." I nodded slowly, surprised but calm. A few years ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. Now I knew better. Success meant nothing if it stole your peace. That evening, I told Ethan about the offer. He looked at me thoughtfully. "You've earned it, Lauren. You've earned everything you have. But if you say no, I'll still be proud." I smiled. "I think I've chased enough titles. Maybe it's time to chase balance." He nodded, smiling softly. "You already found it." Weeks later, Victoria visited Chicago again, this time for good. She decided to stay near their mother, start her own small consulting business, and live at her own pace. One evening, she joined Ethan and me for dinner at a little lakeside restaurant. Nothing fancy, just candlelight and laughter. Halfway through the meal, she looked at me with a gentle smile. "Do you remember that night?" I chuckled. "Which one?" "The one where I thought I was teaching you about class," she said with a hint of embarrassment. "You let me talk for hours without stopping me. I thought you were impressed. I had no idea you were quietly dissecting every word I said." I laughed softly. "I wasn't dissecting. Just observing." She leaned forward. "You could have destroyed me that night, Lauren. But you didn't. You taught me what grace looks like when it wins. I held her gaze. It's not grace that wins, Victoria. It's humility. Grace is just what's left when pride burns away. Her eyes softened. Then maybe that's the best lesson I've ever learned. That night, as Ethan and I walked along the lakefront, the sky stretched wide and golden over the water. I stopped for a moment, feeling the wind brush against my face, the city lights glittering behind us. All my life, I'd been chasing the next step, the next title, the next goal, the next validation. But standing there, hand in hand with the man who now understood me fully, watching the world soften into stillness, I realized something deeper than success. True power isn't the ability to rise above others. It's the strength to remain kind when you finally can. It's refusing to shrink, but also refusing to crush. It's standing tall, not to cast a shadow, but to light the way. And maybe, that was my legacy. Not the mergers or titles or bonuses, but the moments where I chose dignity over ego, compassion over revenge, truth over noise. As we headed home, Ethan looked at me and smiled. You know, you never really fought her. You just showed her who you were. I smiled back. Sometimes that's the loudest fight of all. The city lights shimmered against the glass towers as we drove past. My city, my story, my peace. I had spent a lifetime building my worth in silence, and now, that silence finally spoke louder than any applause ever could. Because real class isn't about what you have. It's about who you are when no one's watching. And in that quiet truth I knew, I had already won.